Nathan Cross had exactly $14 in his wallet, an eviction notice folded into a square so small it could fit in his shirt pocket, and two daughters in the back seat of a dying Honda who still believed their father could fix anything. Tonight, he would learn he couldn't. Tomorrow, a woman in a wheelchair would roll into his life and offer him a deal that sounded like salvation and felt like a trap, a contract, a marriage, a year of pretending. He had no idea that saying yes to a stranger's gratitude would force him to confront the very company that had destroyed his career in the first place. If you want to see how far a broken man will go to save his family, stay until the end, hit like, leave a comment, and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. The rain in Seattle never announced itself. It just arrived, soft and gray, settling over the city like something that had always been there and always would be. Nathan Cross stood under the awning of a laundromat on Aurora Avenue with his hands jammed in the pockets of a jacket that had stopped keeping anyone warm 2 winters ago, watching the water pool in the gutter and thinking about the number 14. $14. He had counted it 3 times in the truck, as if the bills might multiply if he stared at them hard enough, the way his daughter Maddie used to believe that wishing on the microwave clock when it hit 11:11 actually did something. It didn't. Nothing did. Not anymore. "Dad, are we going to the motel again?" Lily asked from the back seat, her voice carrying that particular flatness that 9-year-olds shouldn't have. She wasn't scared. That was the part that gutted him. She wasn't scared because she'd done this enough times that it had become routine, the way some kids had routines about brushing their teeth or packing lunch. "We're figuring it out, baby," Nathan said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Lily had her mother's eyes, dark and quick. And right now they were studying him with the kind of patience that made him want to put his fist through the steering wheel. "We can sleep in the car," 6-year-old Sophie offered helpfully, hugging the stuffed rabbit that had lost 1 ear somewhere around her 4th birthday and never gotten it back. "We did it before. It was kind of like camping." "It's not camping, Soph," Lily said, not unkindly, just correcting the record the way older siblings did. "It was fun, though." Nathan closed his eyes for a second longer than a blink. The eviction notice was sitting on the passenger seat, and he didn't need to unfold it again to remember the language. 30 days. He'd had 30 days and used 29 of them, hoping for a miracle that hadn't come, applying to jobs that wanted engineers with clean references and no 4-year gap explained only by the word litigation. And now here he was on day 30 with $14 and a car that smelled like wet carpet, and a landlord who had stopped returning his calls 2 weeks ago because what was there left to discuss? "Dad?" Lily again. "You're doing the thing where you go quiet." "I'm not going quiet." "You are. You do it when you're scared." He looked at her in the mirror and forced something onto his face that was supposed to resemble a smile, the kind of smile a father gave his kids when the alternative was letting them see exactly how close to the edge he was standing. "I'm not scared. I'm thinking." "That's the same thing for you," Lily said, and turned back to the window, and Nathan thought, not for the first time, that 9 years old was too young to be that perceptive, and too young to have learned it from watching him. He drove because driving felt like doing something, even when it wasn't. He ended up on a side street near Capitol Hill, in front of a small cafe called Birchlight that had warm yellow light spilling out onto the wet sidewalk, the kind of place that smelled like cinnamon and ambition before you even opened the door. He told himself he was just looking for a bathroom the girls could use, somewhere with heat for 10 minutes before the cold car again. He told himself a lot of things that night. Inside, the cafe was half full, mostly laptops and lattes, a barista with sleeve tattoos calling out names that weren't real names. "Order for Crystal Light Brew, that's a flat white." And Nathan steered the girls toward the bathroom in the back, telling them to wash up, take their time, he'd be right outside. He stood near the counter afterward, not buying anything, just absorbing the warmth like a man trying to store it up for later, and that was when he noticed her. She was at a corner table by the window, alone, a tablet propped in front of her that she wasn't really looking at. Late 20s, early 30s maybe, sharp-featured in a way that read as expensive even from across the room, not flashy, just precise, the kind of put-together that came from people who had assistants who picked out their clothes. Her wheelchair was tucked close to the table, a sleek, matte black thing that looked more like engineering than medical equipment. She had a coffee going cold in front of her and an expression Nathan recognized because he wore a version of it himself most days, someone working very hard to look like nothing was wrong. He didn't think anything of her, not really, not beyond the brief and harmless way you notice another person in a room. He was thinking about $14 and a car, and how he was going to explain to two little girls why dinner tonight was going to be from the gas station again. He didn't notice that she was staring at him until she'd already half risen in her seat, hand braced on the table, eyes locked on his face like she'd seen a ghost. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was clear, carrying, the kind of voice used to being listened to. "I'm sorry, this is going to sound strange. Were you ever near the I-5 overpass near the Ship Canal Bridge about 6 years ago? In November?" Nathan blinked. "What?" "A car accident. A black sedan went off the embankment in the rain. There was a man who climbed down, who pulled someone out before the car." She stopped herself, steadying her breath, and Nathan watched something flicker behind her composed face, something raw she hadn't planned on showing a stranger in a coffee shop. "I know it's a strange question. I just need to know if it was you." And there it was. A memory Nathan hadn't touched in years, because touching it meant touching everything that came after it. The lawsuits, the unemployment, the divorce, all of it tangled together like roots under a fence he'd been trying to step over ever since. He remembered rain that night too. He remembered the smell of gasoline and the sound a car makes when it's settling into a position it was never built to be in. And he remembered a woman's hand gripping his wrist so hard it left bruises. And he remembered telling her to look at him. Just look at him. Don't look at the car. Look at me. "That was you," he said slowly. It wasn't a question by the time it left his mouth. The woman in the wheelchair let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, somewhere she'd been holding for 6 years. "I never got your name. The paramedics took you before I tried to find you afterward. I had people look. I never found you. Nathan." He didn't extend his hand because something about the moment felt too large for a handshake. "Nathan Cross. Vivian Ashcroft." She said it like she expected the name to mean something, and when his face stayed blank, something like relief crossed hers, like she was grateful, for once, to be looked at as just a person and not a name attached to a company. "You saved my life. I've thought about it more times than I can count. You pulled me out of that car, and you didn't wait for thanks. You just handed me off to the paramedics, and you were gone before I could—" She stopped again, visibly working to keep her composure, and Nathan understood, in that moment, that this woman had spent 6 years carrying something she'd never been able to put down. "You don't owe me anything," Nathan said, because it felt like the thing she needed to hear, and also because it was true. He hadn't done it for thanks. He'd done it because there was a person trapped in a car, and his body had moved before his mind finished deciding to let it. "I'm not in the business of believing that," Vivian said, and there was a flicker of something sharper underneath the gratitude now, something that suggested the soft moment was closing. And a different kind of woman was stepping forward, one who built companies and made decisions, and didn't let debt sit unpaid. "Will you sit down? Just for a few minutes, please." Behind him, Nathan heard the bathroom door open, heard Lily's voice. "Dad, Sophie won't stop playing with the soap dispenser." And he turned to see his daughters coming toward him, Sophie's sleeves soaked to the elbow, Lily wearing the long-suffering expression of an oldest child everywhere. Vivian's eyes moved to the girls, and something in her face changed again, softened in a different direction. "Yours?" "Yeah." Nathan put a hand on each of their shoulders. An instinct as old as fatherhood, the need to put your body between your children and anything unknown. "This is Lily, and this is Sophie." "Hi," Sophie said immediately, with the fearless friendliness of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned the world contained reasons to be cautious. "Why do you have a cool wheelchair? It has lights on the wheels." "Sophie," Lily hissed. "It's a fair question," Vivian said, and smiled at Sophie in a way that looked almost involuntary, like the kid had caught her off guard. "I like to be able to find my wheelchair in the dark. The lights help." "That's smart," Sophie said, satisfied, and immediately lost interest, tugging on Nathan's jacket. "Dad, can we get hot chocolate?" Nathan felt his stomach drop because the answer was no. The answer was always no lately, and he hated the particular shame of having to say no to something so small in front of a stranger. "We don't have—" he started. "On me," Vivian said quickly, already raising a hand toward the barista, and there was something in the speed of it, the lack of hesitation, that told Nathan this woman was used to solving small problems before anyone had to feel the weight of them. "Please, let me. 2 hot chocolates, whatever they want." He should have said no. Pride told him to say no. But Lily's eyes had gone wide and hopeful in a way he hadn't seen in weeks, and Sophie was already bouncing slightly, and Nathan found himself nodding instead, hating himself a little, grateful anyway. While the girls settled at a nearby table with their hot chocolates, Sophie immediately attempting to eat the whipped cream with a spoon like dessert, Lily watching everything with the careful suspicion of a child who'd learned that good things sometimes came with conditions, Vivian gestured for Nathan to sit across from her. "I'll be direct," she said. "I'm not in the habit of inserting myself into strangers' lives, but you saved mine, and I have spent 6 years feeling like that debt was never settled, and now you're sitting in front of me with 2 kids and... Forgive me, but it doesn't take an investigator to see that something is wrong." Nathan felt heat rise in his face. "We're fine." "You're not." Vivian said it gently, but it landed like a verdict anyway. "I don't say that to embarrass you. I say it because I recognize what it looks like when someone is holding everything together with nothing but stubbornness, because that's how I've spent the last several years of my life. And I'd know the look anywhere." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Not without his voice cracking. And he wasn't going to let that happen in front of his daughters, or this woman, or anyone. "What happened?" Vivian asked. "If you don't mind telling me." Nathan looked at his hands. They were good hands, careful hands. The hands of a man who used to design structural retrofits for bridges and overpasses, who used to walk onto job sites and have younger engineers ask him questions like he had answers. "I was a structural engineer, senior position at a firm downtown, good firm, good projects. About 4 years ago, there was a building collapse. A parking structure under construction, not finished yet, thank God. No one was inside when it went, but it could have killed people if the timing had been different. I'd flagged the load calculations months before it happened, wrote it up, sent it up the chain, got told to stop slowing down the schedule." He exhaled. "When it collapsed, the company needed someone to blame that wasn't the company. I had the paper trail showing I'd raised concerns, which made me inconvenient instead of innocent. They didn't fire me outright. They made my life impossible until I quit, and then they made sure nobody in this city would touch my resume after that. Called it mutual separation in writing and something else entirely on the phone, whenever a prospective employer called for a reference." "That's not legal," Vivian said quietly. "Tell that to the lawyer I couldn't afford to hire." Nathan gave a short, humorless laugh. "My wife left about 18 months into all of that. I don't blame her, not really. I wasn't easy to live with. I was angry all the time, and then I wasn't angry. I was just gone, sitting in the same room as her, and not really there. She's remarried now, lives in Portland. The girls see her twice a year and call her on the phone, and that's its own kind of fine, I guess." He glanced toward Lily and Sophie, who were now engaged in an intense disagreement about whether whipped cream counted as a vegetable. "I've had 4 jobs in 3 years. None of them lasted because the gap on my resume scares people, and the ones who ask about it directly don't call back. Tonight, I got an eviction notice. We've got $14 in a car that's 2 oil changes overdue, and that's the truth of it, since you asked." Vivian was quiet for a long moment, her jaw tight, her eyes somewhere past him. "What was the name of the firm? Why?" "Humor me. Granger Holt Structural. Why does it matter?" Something passed over her face, too fast for Nathan to name it, gone before he could ask, and she shook her head slightly. "It doesn't. Not tonight. I just wanted to know." She straightened, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something more deliberate, more careful, like a woman approaching a decision she'd already half made and was now testing for cracks. "Nathan, I want to propose something to you, and I need you to actually consider it before you say no, because I suspect your instinct is going to be to say no." "Okay." "I run a company. Ashcroft Dynamics, biomedical engineering, prosthetics, and mobility technology, among other things. I started it 9 years ago, before the accident, and I've run it through 6 years of being the woman in the chair that nobody in that boardroom can quite figure out how to look at directly." Her voice had an edge now, controlled but unmistakable. "There's a faction on my board that has spent the last year building a case that I'm unfit to lead the company. Officially, it's about my judgment, my decision-making, the usual language people use when they want to remove someone without admitting the real reason. Unofficially, it's about the chair, and about the fact that I don't have a husband or family to point to as evidence that I'm a stable, grounded, trustworthy human being, instead of, in their words, an isolated, high-risk liability." "That's disgusting," Nathan said before he could stop himself. "It's also effective, unfortunately, because boardrooms run on optics as much as performance, and I've spent 6 years giving them nothing personal to optic." She looked at him steadily. There is a vote in 5 weeks. If I lose it, I lose the company I built, the company that employs 1,100 people, the company that makes the prosthetics and mobility devices that have changed lives for thousands of people who needed exactly what I needed and didn't have access to it. I am not going to lose that company because a handful of men in suits have decided that a woman in a wheelchair without a husband is too unstable to be trusted. I'm not following what this has to do with me. Vivian took a breath. I want to propose a marriage, a contract marriage, 1 year, fully documented, fully legal, with terms we negotiate in advance and a lawyer present for every piece of it. You and your daughters would live in my house. I would pay you a salary, a substantial one, on top of providing housing, healthcare, everything your family needs. In exchange, I need a husband who looks, on paper and in public, like a stable, devoted family man standing beside me. Someone the board cannot paint as a liability. Someone who already has 2 children who, frankly, would do more to humanize me to that board than any speech I could give in a year. Nathan stared at her. Across the cafe, Sophie laughed at something Lily said. A real laugh, bright and unguarded, and the sound of it cut through the strange, vertiginous moment Nathan found himself suspended in. You're asking me to marry you, he said slowly, because you think it'll help you win a corporate vote. I'm asking you to consider a contract that would change your family's life completely in exchange for helping me protect mine, Vivian said. I'm not asking you to fall in love with me, Nathan. I'm asking you to let me solve a problem that's been keeping me up at night for a year, while I solve one that's clearly been keeping you up for longer than that. This is insane. It is, she agreed. I'm aware of how it sounds. I've never done anything like this in my life. I am, generally, an extremely controlled person, and right now I'm sitting across from a man I haven't seen in 6 years, proposing marriage over hot chocolate, and some part of me is appalled at myself. But I keep thinking about a hand on my wrist in the rain, telling me to look at him, and not the car. And I think the universe doesn't usually hand you the same person twice unless you're supposed to do something with it. Nathan almost laughed, except none of this was funny. I have 2 kids. I'm not going to put them in the middle of some corporate chess game. They wouldn't be in the middle of anything. They'd have a house with a yard, a real bedroom each, a school in a good district, healthcare, stability, things you clearly cannot give them right now through no fault of your own. I would never ask them to perform anything. I would never put them in front of cameras or use them as props. I'm not a monster, Nathan, whatever the board thinks. I just need to walk into a room in 5 weeks with a wedding ring on my finger and a family that exists, and I need it to be real enough that no one can call it staged, because they will look. They will look very, very hard. And what happens after the year's up? We divorce, amicably, with a settlement that sets you and your daughters up for the rest of your lives. Or, if by some chance it isn't unbearable, we don't. That's entirely up to us, and there's no obligation either way. She paused. I want to be honest with you about something else too, because I think you deserve honesty before you decide anything. This isn't only gratitude. It's not only the accident. I have spent 6 years being looked at as a function, the CEO, the woman in the chair, the cautionary tale, the inspiration story, whatever role someone needs me to play that day. And tonight, sitting here talking to you, is the first time in longer than I can remember that I felt like a person talking to another person. I don't know what to do with that, except to tell you it's there. Nathan sat back, his mind spinning through $14 and an eviction notice and a daughter who thought the back seat of a Honda counted as camping, and a woman across the table offering him something that sounded too good to be real, which was usually exactly the kind of thing that turned out to be a trap. I need to think, he said. I need to talk to a lawyer. I can't just say yes to this in a coffee shop. I would be alarmed if you did, Vivian said. I'll have my attorney draft terms tomorrow. You bring your own lawyer, I'll cover the cost, no strings, whether or not you decide to do this, and you go through every line of it until you're satisfied. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to read the contract and decide if the terms protect your daughters the way you need them protected. If they don't, we fix them until they do, or you walk away and I'll still help you find stable work, because that's not contingent on any of this. You saved my life. I owe you that much regardless. Nathan looked over at his daughters again. Sophie had whipped cream on her nose. Lily was watching him now, that same too perceptive look on her face, like she could read the shape of the conversation even from across the room without hearing the words. Can I have a day? He asked. Take 3, Vivian said. But Nathan, she hesitated, and for the first time that night, something uncertain crossed her face, something almost shy. I want you to know that whatever you decide, I meant what I said. I never found you all these years, and not finding you bothered me more than I think is reasonable for a stranger. So whatever this is, however it started, I'm glad it's you sitting here. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, just nodded and gathered his daughters, who waved goodbye to the lady with the cool wheelchair lights as if she were already someone they knew. That night, parked in the lot behind a 24-hour diner because it was the only place that would let him sit without hassling him, Nathan watched his daughters sleep in the back seat under a blanket that smelled like the trunk. And he thought about a contract he hadn't read, a woman he'd pulled out of a wreck 6 years ago, and the number 14, which had not, despite everything, multiplied into anything more. He thought about pride and about how much of it he could afford to keep, and about how the answer, lately, always seemed to be less than he wanted it to be. He thought about Granger Holt Structural too, and the strange flicker on Vivian's face when he'd said the name, and told himself it was nothing. Coincidence. A woman processing a lot of information very fast. He didn't yet know he was wrong. 3 days later, in an attorney's office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, Nathan sat across a long conference table from Vivian Ashcroft and 2 lawyers, one his, paid for by her, one hers, and read through 41 pages of a contract that would house his daughters in a mansion, pay him more than he'd made in his best year as an engineer, guarantee their health care and education, and require him, in exchange, to become a husband in every visible way to a woman he'd met 3 days ago in a coffee shop, with the explicit and repeated assurance, written into the language itself, that his daughter's well-being would override every other clause if the two ever came into conflict. "You're sure about this?" his attorney asked him quietly, during a break, in the hallway. Nathan looked back through the glass at Vivian, sitting very straight in her chair, hands folded, watching him with an expression that was trying very hard to look like patience and not like hope. "I don't think I have another option that gets my kids out of that car," Nathan said. He signed 40 minutes later. Lily and Sophie, waiting in the lobby with a babysitter Vivian had hired for the afternoon, had no idea that their entire lives had just changed with the scratch of a pen, that within 2 weeks they'd be moving out of motels and back seats and into a lakeside house with more bedrooms than they knew what to do with, that their father had just married a stranger to save them, and that the woman they'd met over hot chocolate was about to become, for better or far worse, family. What none of them knew yet, what Vivian herself had only half let herself know, pushed down into the same place she kept all her hardest truths, was that the name Granger Holt Structural was not unfamiliar to her at all. It belonged, 3 acquisitions and 1 corporate restructuring ago, to a subsidiary that had once fallen, briefly, under the umbrella of Ashcroft Dynamics' parent holding company, before she'd taken full control and severed the connection. She hadn't built that fire, but somewhere in the foundation of the empire she'd inherited and grown, there were ashes that belonged to Nathan Cross, and she had known it the moment he said the name in that coffee shop, and she had said nothing, because she'd already decided she needed him too much to risk him walking away. It was a debt she told herself she would settle eventually, when the time was right, when the board vote was won, when the house had filled with enough laughter that the truth wouldn't be able to undo it. She was wrong about that too. But for now, in the lobby of a law office overlooking the bay, Sophie was asking if their new house had a backyard big enough for a trampoline, and Lily was studying Vivian with the wary, searching eyes of a child deciding whether to trust someone. And Nathan Cross, a man who'd had $14 to his name 3 days earlier, watched his daughters meet the woman who had just changed all their lives, and allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to hope that something good might actually be starting. The house sat at the end of a private road on the eastern shore of Lake Washington, glass and cedar and stone. The kind of place Nathan had only ever seen from a car window driving past, never imagining he'd be handed a key to it. Sophie ran through the front door yelling something about echoes, her voice bouncing off ceilings 2 stories high, and Lily stood in the entryway for a long moment, not moving, taking it all in with the same careful suspicion she brought to everything lately. "It's too big," Lily said quietly, just to Nathan, while Vivian was still by the car, talking to the driver who'd helped with their few boxes of belongings. "We can make it smaller," Nathan said. "We'll just live in the kitchen and 1 bedroom and pretend the rest of it doesn't exist." That got something close to a smile out of her, small and reluctant, but real. Vivian had thought of everything, which Nathan would come to learn was simply how she operated, in business and apparently in life. The bedroom she'd prepared for Sophie had a reading nook built into the window, with cushions the exact shade of purple Sophie had mentioned, once, in passing, during the lawyer's office meeting, that she liked. Lily's room had a desk already set up, shelves half filled with books that ranged across enough genres that it was clear someone had genuinely tried to guess at a 9-year-old's taste rather than just buying whatever was popular. There was a tutor on retainer to help the girls catch up on the school transitions they'd suffered through 3 different districts in 2 years. There was a therapist's number taped inside a kitchen drawer, not pushed on anyone, just available, in case. "You didn't have to do all this," Nathan said that first night, standing in the kitchen after the girls had gone to bed, exhausted from exploring every room twice. "I wanted them to feel like they belonged here, not like they were visiting," Vivian said. She was at the kitchen island, a glass of wine in front of her that she hadn't touched, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that told Nathan the day had cost her more than she was letting on. "I don't know if it worked. I've never had children in this house before. I wasn't sure what 9-year-olds and 6-year-olds like." "You did fine," Nathan said. "Better than fine. Lily doesn't trust easy, and she already likes her room." "And you?" Vivian asked. "Do you like your room?" There was a pause there that Nathan understood without needing it explained. The question of where he would sleep had been handled, in the contract, with clinical precision. Separate bedrooms, a guest suite on the opposite wing from Vivian's room, language about privacy and boundaries that both their lawyers had insisted on. It was, on paper, the least romantic arrangement 2 married people could have. Nathan had been relieved reading it. He felt something more complicated than relief now, standing in the kitchen, and he didn't examine it too closely. "It's the nicest room I've ever slept in," he said instead. "Probably ruins me for regular rooms forever." Vivian almost laughed, and the sound of it, brief and unguarded, surprised them both. The first weeks fell into a rhythm that felt, to Nathan's quiet astonishment, less strange than he'd braced for. Vivian left early for the office, often before the girls were even awake, but she was almost always home by 6, which Nathan would learn later was a deliberate choice, not a natural one. She told her assistant to clear her calendar of evening obligations unless absolutely unavoidable, because she wanted to be there for dinner. She didn't explain why. Nathan didn't ask, not at first. Dinner became the anchor of the house. Sophie narrated her day in exhaustive, looping detail, circling back to add forgotten details mid-sentence, and Vivian listened with a focus that struck Nathan as almost startling, given that this woman ran a company with 1,100 employees and somehow still had the bandwidth to ask Sophie follow-up questions about a friend named Deja, who may or may not have been real. "You don't have to do that," Nathan told her one night after the girls had gone up to bed and he was helping clear the table, an act that visibly unsettled the house staff the first few times he did it, like they weren't sure what to do with a husband who rinsed his own dishes. "Do what?" "Pretend to find 6-year-old gossip fascinating." "I'm not pretending," Vivian said, and something flickered across her face, quick and unguarded, the kind of look Nathan was starting to recognize as the real one beneath the composed CEO mask she wore for everyone else. "I never had this. Growing up, I mean. Dinner table, someone asking about my day. My parents ran a company before I did. I was raised by nannies and then by spreadsheets. Sophie telling me a 15-minute story about a girl who may or may not exist is, genuinely, the best part of my day. I'm aware of how pathetic that sounds." "It doesn't sound pathetic," Nathan said, and meant it, and something passed between them in the kitchen that neither of them named. Lily took longer to thaw. She was polite to Vivian, careful, the way she was careful with everything since her mother left, like she'd learned that liking someone too quickly only made it worse when they disappeared. Vivian never pushed. She let Lily set the pace, answered her questions when Lily asked them, and Lily asked a lot, sharp, specific questions about the wheelchair, about the accident, about the company, about whether this was all really real or whether they'd have to leave again in a year, with a directness that Nathan suspected Lily was testing, waiting to see if Vivian would flinch or lie or soften the truth into something more comfortable. She never did. "Will we have to leave?" Lily asked one evening, maybe 3 weeks in, apropos of nothing, while Vivian was helping her with a math worksheet at the kitchen table because the new tutor hadn't started yet. Vivian set down her pencil. "I don't know yet. There's a chance this could be permanent. There's a chance it won't be. I'm not going to lie to you about that because I think you'd know if I did, and I'd rather you trust the things I tell you, even when they're not the answer you want." Lily studied her for a long moment. "Okay," she said finally, like she was filing the answer away for later use, and went back to her fractions. And Nathan, watching from the doorway, felt something in his chest loosen that he hadn't realized was clenched. It was 3 weeks after they'd moved in that Nathan saw, for the first time, the version of Vivian that lived underneath the composure. He'd gotten up around 2 in the morning for water and found the kitchen light on, and Vivian sitting at the island in sweatpants and an old college sweatshirt, hair down instead of in its usual sharp twist, a heating pad pressed against her lower back, her face tight with a kind of pain Nathan recognized because he'd worn versions of it himself. The pain that you got good at hiding because hiding it was easier than explaining it. "Sorry," she said immediately, straightening, reaching for the composure like a coat she'd left within arm's reach. "I didn't think anyone would be up." "You don't have to apologize for being in your own kitchen," Nathan said, getting his glass of water, and then, when she didn't relax, "Is it bad tonight?" "It's fine." "Vivian." She looked at him, surprised, maybe, that he'd pushed instead of letting the lie stand, and something in her face cracked slightly. "The nerve damage from the accident. It's not just the legs. There's pain that comes and goes, some nights worse than others, and there's not a lot anyone can do about it except wait it out. I don't like people seeing it. I spent the first 2 years after the accident with everyone treating me like I might break, and I decided I'd rather they thought I was made of steel." "I'm not everyone," Nathan said, and sat down across from her, not making a thing of it, just present. "You don't have to perform steel for me at 2 in the morning. Nobody's grading you." Vivian laughed, short and surprised, and some of the tension went out of her shoulders. "That's either the kindest thing anyone's said to me in years or the most obvious, and I genuinely can't tell which. Probably both." They sat in the kitchen for almost an hour that night, not talking about anything important, Vivian telling him, in fragments, about the accident. Not the rescue itself, she still couldn't talk about that part without her voice changing, but the year after, the surgeries, the rehabilitation, the moment she'd had to decide whether grief was going to be the rest of her life or just a chapter of it. And Nathan telling her in turn about the parking structure collapse, about the sound it made, about the year he'd spent waiting for someone in his old industry to vouch for him and watching the silence stretch out instead. "You said the name of the firm once," Vivian said carefully, somewhere near the end of the conversation, not quite looking at him. "Granger Holt." "Yeah." "Do you know what happened to them after you left?" Nathan shrugged. "Heard they got bought out a couple years back, folded into some bigger holding company. I try not to follow it too closely. It's not good for my blood pressure." "Right," Vivian said, and something in her voice was careful in a way that Nathan, exhausted, half asleep on his feet by then, didn't catch. Probably wise. She didn't tell him that night. She told herself there would be a better time, a calmer time, a time when the board fight wasn't looming over both of them, and his trust in her wasn't still something newly built, fragile as the first ice on the lake outside, not yet able to bear weight. It was a mistake she would understand much later, that she'd made out of fear rather than strategy, and fear was rarely a good architect. The board fight, meanwhile, was getting uglier. Nathan learned the shape of it slowly, in pieces Vivian let slip during dinners that ran later once the girls had gone up, in the documents she sometimes left open on her laptop at the kitchen island, and the tightness around her eyes on the days her assistant called twice before 9 in the morning. The man leading the charge against her was a board member named Carl Whitfield, a holdover from her father's era who had never fully accepted that the company was hers now, and not a relic he was minding until someone more appropriate took over. Whitfield had spent the better part of a year building a coalition, quietly, methodically, framing his case not as discrimination. He was too smart for that, Vivian said, gritting her teeth around the word smart like it tasted bad, but as concern. Concern about her health, concern about decision fatigue from chronic pain, concern about isolation, about a CEO with no family, no anchor, nothing grounding her except 80-hour weeks and a company that had become her entire identity. "He's not wrong that the company is my entire identity," Vivian admitted one night, frustration cracking through her usual control. "That's not the part that makes me angry. The part that makes me angry is that he thinks that's a flaw specific to me. Like every successful man I've ever met didn't also disappear into his work, except nobody calls them unstable for it. They call it dedication. So show him otherwise," Nathan said. "That's what you are," Vivian said, gesturing vaguely, somewhere between Nathan and the staircase that led up to where the girls were sleeping. "You and the girls. You're the otherwise." It should have stung, hearing himself described as a strategic asset in a corporate war, a checkbox on someone's PR plan. Instead, watching Vivian's face in the low kitchen light, the exhaustion under her anger, Nathan felt something that surprised him. He wanted to help her win, not because the contract obligated him to, because somewhere in 3 weeks of dinners and 2 a.m., kitchen conversations, and Sophie climbing into Vivian's lap uninvited to show her a drawing, something had shifted and Nathan found that he cared, actually cared, not contractually cared, whether this woman kept the company she'd spent her life building. "Then let's win it," he said. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her eyes. "It's not that simple." "I didn't say it was simple. I said let's win it." She smiled then, small and tired but real, and Nathan thought not for the first time that a real smile looked almost nothing like the one she wore in public, the one calibrated for cameras and boardrooms. The real one was crooked, a little surprised at itself, like it hadn't been let out in a while and wasn't quite sure of its welcome. The girls, for their part, had no concept that they were living inside anyone's strategy. To Sophie and Lily, Vivian had simply become a fixture of daily life. The woman who knew the names of all of Sophie's stuffed animals within a week, who let Lily help with spreadsheets on weekends by giving her a fake budget to manage that was secretly teaching her real math, who never once treated either of them like an obligation. Sophie had started calling her Viv within the first 10 days, an informality Nathan had braced to correct, and Vivian had waved off with visible delight. Lily took longer, 6 weeks before she dropped the Vivian for Viv, too. And Nathan watched Vivian's face the first time it happened, the way she went still for a second, like she was trying not to let the moment mean as much as it clearly did. "She called me Viv," Vivian told him later that night, in the kitchen, like she was reporting a business milestone rather than a 9-year-old's casual nickname shift. "I don't think you understand what that means coming from her." "I understand exactly what it means," Nathan said. "She's careful with people. She doesn't give nicknames to people she doesn't trust." "I don't deserve that yet," Vivian said quietly. "Maybe not yet," Nathan agreed, not unkindly. "But you're earning it." There were harder nights, too. Nights when Sophie cried for her mother. A confusion of missing someone who'd chosen to be far away and not quite understanding why. Nights when Lily's careful composure cracked and she snapped at Nathan over something small, really crying about something much larger. The unsteadiness of a life that kept rearranging itself around her without her consent. On one of those nights, Lily locked herself in her new room and refused to come down for dinner. And it was Vivian, not Nathan, who eventually went up, knocked, and sat outside the closed door for 40 minutes, not pushing, not lecturing, just talking quietly through the wood about nothing in particular, until Lily finally opened the door herself. Nathan, listening from the bottom of the stairs, didn't hear most of what was said. He heard enough to understand that Vivian had told her, at some point, about her own mother, about growing up feeling like a line item in someone else's company rather than a daughter, about how she understood, more than Lily probably realized, what it felt like to be rearranged by adults who said it was for your own good. "I'm not trying to replace your mom," he heard Vivian say, near the end, her voice low through the door. "I would never try to do that. I just want you to know that whatever this house is, however long it lasts, you have a person in it who's on your side. That's not conditional. That doesn't go away even if the contract does." Lily came down for dinner that night. She didn't say much, but she sat next to Vivian instead of across from her for the first time, and Nathan caught Vivian's eyes across the table and saw, plainly, how much that small repositioning had cost her to receive without falling apart. Later, after the girls were asleep, Nathan found Vivian on the back deck, looking out at the lake, the lights of the opposite shore scattered like something spilled. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight, for Lily." She didn't need much. She just needed someone to not need anything from her for once. Vivian didn't turn around. "I meant what I told her. I know I'm not supposed to get attached to either of them past the terms of a contract, and clearly I have failed spectacularly at that particular boundary." "I don't think either of us is very good at the boundaries anymore," Nathan said, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "No," Vivian agreed. "I don't think we are." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that had weight to it, the kind two people share when they both know something is shifting between them and neither one is ready to name it out loud, because naming it would mean admitting how far outside the lines of the contract they'd already wandered. "Can I ask you something?" Nathan said eventually. "Always." "Do you regret it?" "The proposal. All of this. Vivian turned to look at him then, the lake light catching the side of her face, and for a moment her expression was so open, so unguarded, that Nathan felt like he was seeing something he hadn't earned access to yet. "No," she said. "I regret a lot of things in my life, Nathan. I don't regret this. Not for a single day. If anything, I'm starting to be afraid of what happens when it ends." "Maybe it doesn't have to end," Nathan said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Vivian didn't answer right away. She looked back out at the water, and Nathan thought he saw her throat work, like she was holding something back, some truth she wasn't ready to hand him yet, sitting heavier in her than the question deserved. "There's a board meeting in 2 weeks," she said finally, sidestepping. "The real one. The vote. I need you there, beside me, the whole day. I need them to look at you and see exactly what they're afraid I don't have." "I'll be there," Nathan said. "Whatever you need." "I know," Vivian said softly, and there was something almost sad in how she said it, gratitude tangled up with guilt that Nathan couldn't read yet, didn't have the context to read yet, because the woman beside him was already carrying a secret that had been sitting in her chest for weeks, growing heavier every night she chose comfort over confession, every dinner that felt too good to risk, every small victory with the girls that made the truth feel like something that could wait just one more day. It couldn't, though. Not for much longer. And somewhere underneath the warmth that had quietly taken over that lakeside house, the hot chocolate mornings, the math worksheets, the 2 a.m. kitchen conversations, a 9-year-old finally calling someone Viv like she meant it. A clock had already started running on a truth that was going to come due whether Vivian was ready or not. 3 days before this board vote, Nathan found a banker's box in the garage. He hadn't been snooping. That was the part he kept replaying afterward, the part that mattered to him even though it wouldn't matter to anyone else. He'd been looking for a tennis racket Sophie swore was out there somewhere, some relic of a sporting goods kick she'd been on for exactly 9 days the previous spring. And in the process of moving boxes around the immaculate, climate-controlled garage that was nicer than any apartment he'd ever rented, he'd knocked one over. Papers slid out across the concrete. Old financial filings, it looked like. The kind of dense corporate documentation that meant nothing to him at a glance, except one folder had a name tab on it in handwriting he recognized as Vivian's, and the name on the tab was Granger Holt Structural. He told himself not to look. He looked anyway. It wasn't a smoking gun, not in the way it would have been in a movie. It was worse, in its way, because it was dry and bureaucratic and absolutely damning once he understood what he was reading. A holding company timeline, acquisition dates, a corporate family tree that traced Ashcroft Dynamics' parent entity, 3 years before Vivian had taken sole control, back through a tangle of subsidiaries that included, for an 18-month window, Granger Holt Structural. The exact period, Nathan realized with a cold drop in his stomach, during which the parking structure collapse had happened, during which his career had been quietly, deliberately dismantled by a company protecting its own liability. There was a printed email chain in the folder too, dated only 6 weeks ago, between Vivian and someone from her legal department, the subject line reading simply Granger Holt/Historical Liability Review, confidential. Nathan read 3 lines of it before his hands started shaking too badly to keep holding the page steady. She'd known. Not vaguely, not as some hazy historical footnote she'd stumbled into after the fact. She'd ordered a review 6 weeks ago, weeks after they'd already moved in, weeks after hot chocolate and math worksheets and a 9-year-old learning to say Viv like she meant it. And she'd said nothing. She'd sat across from him at that kitchen island late at night and asked him offhand careful questions about Granger Holt's fate, like she didn't already have an entire confidential file on it sitting in a banker's box in her own garage. He put the folder back. He didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. Some old habit of not wanting to be caught with something he wasn't supposed to have. And he walked back into the house and stood in the kitchen for a long time, not moving, the tennis racket forgotten entirely. He didn't say anything that night. He told himself he needed to think, needed to be sure of what he'd seen before he detonated something that couldn't be put back together, and some smaller, more honest part of him admitted he was scared. Scared of being right. Scared of what being right would mean for the house, for the girls, for the fragile, unnamed thing that had been growing between him and Vivian in increments so small neither of them had dared to call it by its real name. Sophie noticed something was wrong at dinner. She always noticed things, in her own 6-year-old way, oblivious to subtlety but sharply attuned to mood. "Dad, you're doing the quiet thing," she said, echoing Lily's words from weeks earlier, words from a different car, a different kind of crisis. Are we leaving again? No, baby, Nathan said, and hated how automatic the reassurance came, how easily lies slid out of him now when his daughters needed comfort, the same way they always had. I'm just tired. Vivian caught his eye across the table and something passed over her face. Not suspicion exactly, but a flicker of unease, like she could read weather changing in him even if she couldn't name the storm yet. He waited 2 more days. He told himself he was choosing the right moment, but the truth was closer to cowardice. He kept hoping, against everything he'd read, that there would turn out to be an explanation that made it not what it looked like. There wasn't. The board vote was now 1 day away, and Nathan understood, watching Vivian prep for it that final night. Going over talking points at the kitchen island with the focused intensity of someone walking into a fight she could lose everything from. That if he didn't say something now, he was going to walk into that boardroom tomorrow standing beside her, performing devotion for a panel of strangers, while carrying a truth that made the whole performance into something closer to a lie. Vivian, he said, after the girls had gone to bed, we need to talk. Something in his voice must have carried the weight of it, because she set down her pen immediately, all her attention swinging toward him. What's wrong? I found a folder in the garage, looking for Sophie's tennis racket. He watched her face as he said it, watched the exact moment the color started leaving it. Granger Holt Structural, a whole timeline, an email from 6 weeks ago about a historical liability review. Vivian went very still. For a long moment, she didn't say anything at all, and the silence told Nathan everything the file already had. There was no innocent explanation coming, no version of this where he'd misunderstood. You knew, he said, when she didn't speak. Not just generally, you knew specifically. You ordered a review 6 weeks ago. We've been living here for over a month, and you sat across from me and asked me, like you didn't already know the whole history, like you were just curious. I should have told you sooner, Vivian said, her voice low, controlled in the way Nathan now understood was how she sounded when she was holding something back from shattering completely. I know that. I've known that for weeks. How long have you actually known? Not the 6 weeks, the real answer. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. Since the cafe, since the night I recognized you. The kitchen seemed to tilt slightly. You're telling me you knew, that very first night, that your company was connected to the thing that destroyed my life, and you sat there and offered me a contract anyway, and never said a word. I didn't know everything that night. I knew the name sounded familiar. I went back afterward, before the wedding, and had someone in legal quietly pull the history, and yes, I found out Granger Holt had been under our parent holding company's umbrella during the exact period you described. I found out what happened to you wasn't a coincidence of bad luck and a bad employer. It happened inside a corporate structure that eventually became part of what I now run. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. I want you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just react to it. I did not cause what happened to you. I wasn't running that company when the collapse happened. I wasn't even fully in control of the parent entity yet. My father was still alive, still making decisions, and Granger Holt was one of dozens of subsidiaries under an umbrella I didn't have operational authority over. I didn't know about you, specifically, until years later, until that cafe. But you found out. Before the wedding, and you let me sign a contract that put my daughters in this house. Let me believe this was about gratitude and a rescue on a highway, when really... Nathan's voice cracked, and he hated it, hated that he couldn't keep it steady. Was any of it real, or was I just convenient? A man you already owed something to, a man whose silence you needed ensured? Don't, Vivian said sharply, something fierce breaking through the careful control. Don't you dare reduce this to that. Everything that's happened in this house has been real. Every dinner, every conversation, the way Sophie climbs into my lap like she's always belonged there, the way Lily finally trusts me enough to be angry at me when she needs to be. None of that was strategy, Nathan. I have never once, in my entire life, let myself feel the things I feel sitting at that table with the 3 of you. And you think I orchestrated that? I think you had a secret that could destroy everything you just described, and you decided to keep building a life on top of it, instead of telling me the truth and letting me decide for myself whether I could live with it. Because I was scared, Vivian said, and her voice broke on the word, the composure finally giving out entirely. I was scared that the moment you knew you'd see me the way you're looking at me right now, like I'm part of the company that ruined you, like I'm one more person who used a tragedy in your life to get something I wanted. I told myself I'd find the right moment. I told myself once the board vote was settled, once you trusted me enough to hear the whole thing without it breaking everything we'd built, I'd tell you. I was wrong. I know I was wrong, but I need you to understand that the guilt is what made me approach you that night in the cafe in the first place. And somewhere along the way, guilt turned into something else, something that had nothing to do with debt or strategy or atonement. I fell for you, Nathan. I fell for your daughters. And every day that passed where I didn't tell you, I told myself it was because the timing was wrong, when really it was because I was a coward who didn't want to lose the first real thing I'd had in years. Nathan stood in the kitchen, breathing hard, trying to hold on to his anger because the anger was simpler than the grief underneath it. The grief of learning that the home he'd let himself believe in had a fault line running straight through its foundation. My daughters slept in a car, he said quietly. Do you understand that? Sophie thought it was camping because I never let her see how scared I was. Lily stopped believing things could get better at 9 years old because every time we found stable ground, it got pulled out from under her again. And the reason we ended up in that situation in the first place is sitting 3 feet away from me in a kitchen that her company's money built. I know, Vivian said, tears finally breaking loose, sliding down her face without her bothering to hide them anymore. I know, and there is nothing I can say that makes that fact smaller. I can't undo what Granger Holt did to you. I can't go back and stop a collapse that happened years before I had any power to stop anything. All I can do is tell you the truth now, completely, and let you decide what to do with it, even if what you decide is that you can't forgive me. Even if what you decide is that tomorrow you walk into that boardroom and tell every single person in it exactly what kind of company they're really protecting. The room went quiet. Outside, the lake was dark. The opposite shore's lights blurred faintly through the window, and Nathan stood with his back against the counter, feeling something in his chest that he didn't have a clean name for. Not just anger, not just betrayal, but the disorienting grief of having to hold two true things at once, that this woman had hidden something enormous from him, and that everything she'd said about the dinners, about Sophie, about Lily, had also somehow still felt true while she was saying it. I need to be alone, he said finally. I can't do this right now. Nathan, I'm not leaving tonight. I'm not taking the girls anywhere at midnight. His voice was flat, exhausted. But I need you to not talk to me right now, because everything I want to say is going to come out worse than I mean it, and I don't want to say something to you that I can't take back. Not with my kids asleep upstairs in a house that might not be theirs by next week anyway. Vivian nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand, the gesture stripped of all the polish she usually carried. Okay, she whispered. Okay. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed in the guest suite that had felt, weeks ago, like the nicest room he'd ever slept in, and now felt like a stranger's house again. A place he had no real claim to, built on money that traced back, however indirectly, to the worst year of his life. He thought about Lily's question, weeks ago. Will we have to leave? And Vivian's answer, I don't know yet. And he understood now that her honesty in that moment had been a kind of camouflage, a true answer to a small question that let her keep hiding the larger one. He thought, too, about the version of events Vivian hadn't lied about. The accident, the rescue, his hand on her wrist in the rain, telling her to look at him. That part, at least, hadn't been engineered. Whatever else this was, it hadn't started as manipulation. It had started with a debt she felt she owed a stranger who happened to save her life, and the debt had curdled into something far more tangled once she discovered who that stranger actually was. It didn't make it forgivable. It didn't make it not forgivable either. Nathan lay awake turning it over until the sky outside started going gray, and somewhere around 5 a.m, exhausted past the point of clear thought, he found himself doing the thing he always did when his mind couldn't settle. He thought about his daughters' faces, Sophie's unguarded laugh at the dinner table, Lily, finally, calling someone Viv. He didn't have an answer by morning. He had a board vote in 12 hours, and a wife he didn't know if he could trust, and 2 little girls downstairs who had no idea any of this was happening, who would wake up expecting pancakes and normalcy in a house that had quietly come apart at the seams overnight. Sophie noticed at breakfast that her father and Vivian weren't talking the way they usually did. No easy back and forth, no Vivian reaching over to steal a bite of his eggs the way she'd started doing as a joke weeks back. "Did you guys have a fight?" Sophie asked, point blank, around a mouthful of cereal. "Grown-up stuff, baby," Nathan said. "Nothing for you to worry about." "That's what you say right before something bad happens," Lily said quietly, not looking up from her own bowl, and the accuracy of it landed like a slap. Vivian, across the table, looked like she hadn't slept either, her eyes red-rimmed under careful concealer, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking. "Nothing bad is happening to either of you," she said, and her voice, though tired, was steady, deliberate. "Whatever happens with grown-ups, that part is separate. You two are not losing this house, this school, any of it, regardless of anything else. I need you to know that's true no matter what." But it was, Nathan realized, watching her say it, the most important thing she could have said in that moment. Not to him, but to his daughters. A promise that put their stability above whatever was unraveling between the two adults who'd built it. Whatever else was true about Vivian Ashcroft, she had not, even now, even broken open by her own guilt, let that guilt touch the girls. He left for the office with her 3 hours later anyway, because whatever was unresolved between them, the board vote didn't care about his feelings, and 1,100 employees' jobs were still hanging on a meeting that would happen with or without his clarity. He sat beside her in the car in silence, the city sliding by outside the windows, and somewhere around the Fremont Bridge, Vivian spoke without looking at him. "You don't have to come in if you can't," she said. "I won't blame you. I have no right to ask anything else of you after what I did." Nathan looked out the window for a long moment. "I'm coming in," he said finally. "Not because I've forgiven you. I haven't decided that yet, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make today easier for you. I'm coming in because 1,100 people don't deserve to lose their health care, because Carl Whitfield doesn't think a woman in a wheelchair can run a company, and because whatever you did to me, you didn't do it to them, and I'm not going to let my anger at you cost them something they had nothing to do with." Vivian's eyes filled again, but she blinked it back, nodding once, sharp and grateful and ashamed all at once. "That's more grace than I deserve." "Probably," Nathan said. "Doesn't mean it's not true." The Ashcroft Dynamics headquarters occupied 11 floors of a glass tower downtown, and the boardroom on the top floor had a view of the Sound that, under different circumstances, Nathan might have found beautiful. Today it just felt like a stage, every window letting in a flat gray light that made the long table and the dozen men and women seated around it look like a tribunal. Carl Whitfield sat near the head of the table, a silver-haired man in his 60s with the kind of unbothered patrician calm that came from never having had to fight for anything in his life. He nodded at Vivian as she wheeled in, polite, professional, utterly unrevealing of the knife he was about to put forward. His eyes moved to Nathan with open assessment, cataloging him the way Nathan imagined Whitfield cataloged everything, as an asset or a liability, nothing in between. "Mr. Cross," Whitfield said, extending a hand, "I understand you're the husband. We've heard a great deal about you these past weeks." "All good things, I hope," Nathan said, shaking his hand, keeping his voice level even though every part of him was still raw from the night before. "That remains to be seen," Whitfield said with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes, and took his seat. The meeting opened formally. Minutes from the last session, a brief financial update that Vivian delivered with crisp, unshaken authority, numbers that, Nathan noted even in his distracted state, were strong, the company performing well by every conventional measure that should have made this whole fight unnecessary. Then Whitfield rose, and the real meeting began. He was good. Nathan would give him that. He never once used the word disability, never once said anything that could be quoted back as discriminatory. He spoke instead about governance stability, about the unique pressures of leading a company of this scale, about patterns of isolation that the board has a fiduciary responsibility to examine. He referenced, with careful vagueness, concerns raised by multiple stakeholders, about Vivian's capacity to sustain the demands of the role long-term, and gestured more than once toward a binder in front of him that he never fully opened, letting its existence imply more than its contents could have proven. "I want to be clear," Whitfield said, looking around the table rather than at Vivian, a tactic Nathan recognized immediately as deliberate, "that this is not personal. Ms. Ashcroft has built something remarkable here. But remarkable companies require remarkable stability at the top. And I think we'd be doing this board a disservice if we didn't ask hard questions about what stability looks like for a CEO managing chronic health complications, without, until recently, any visible support system, any partner sharing the weight of that burden." "Well, I'd like to respond to that," Vivian said, and her voice was iron now, every trace of the woman who'd cried in the kitchen the night before folded away somewhere Nathan couldn't see. "Carl, in 9 years of running this company, can you point to a single instance, one, where my health affected a business decision? A quarterly result? A strategic initiative? Not a feeling, Carl. A fact. Whitfield's smile thinned further. It's difficult to quantify what didn't happen, Vivian. That's precisely the nature of risk. That's precisely the nature of bias, Vivian shot back. You're asking this board to remove a CEO based on numbers you admit don't exist, built entirely on a feeling that a woman who uses a wheelchair and doesn't fit your picture of stable leadership must, somewhere, be a liability waiting to happen. I'd like the minutes to reflect that no financial, operational, or governance metric has been presented today to support that claim. For a moment, the room held its breath, and Nathan watched several board members shift in their seats, glancing at each other. The kind of silent recalibration that happened when an argument that had sounded reasonable in private suddenly sounded considerably uglier out loud. It was Whitfield's recovery that turned the room again. Then let's discuss the support system you've raised, since you brought it up yourself, he said smoothly, nodding toward Nathan. A marriage that, from what my sources tell me, occurred with unusual speed, weeks after a chance encounter. I don't say this to embarrass anyone, but the board has a right to ask whether what we're seeing here is a genuine partnership or a convenient performance, timed remarkably well against this very vote. The room's attention swung to Nathan, and he felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes land on him at once, felt the specific vertiginous danger of the moment, because Whitfield wasn't wrong, not entirely, and Nathan had spent the entire drive over not knowing what he was going to say if this exact accusation surfaced. He stood up anyway. I'll answer that myself if that's all right, Nathan said, and Whitfield, caught slightly off guard by a spouse speaking unprompted in a board meeting, gestured for him to continue with a thin, tolerant smile, clearly expecting Nathan to fumble it. You're right that it happened fast, Nathan said. I'm not going to stand here and pretend otherwise, because I think you'd see through it if I tried, and frankly, I'm tired of people in this family tiptoeing around hard truths. He saw Vivian's head turn sharply toward him, surprise flickering across her face. 6 years ago, your CEO pulled herself, barely, out of a wrecked car on the I-5 overpass because a stranger climbed down an embankment and got her out before that car went up. I was that stranger. I didn't know her name. She didn't know mine. We didn't see each other again for 6 years until she recognized me in a coffee shop at what was, without exaggeration, the lowest point of my life. Homeless, jobless, raising 2 daughters alone with $14 to my name. The room had gone very still. She offered me a contract, Nathan continued. I won't pretend it started as a love story because it didn't. It started as a transaction, and I think every person in this room understands transactions. What none of you can see from a binder, Mr. Whitfield, is what happens in that house every night that isn't in any contract. You can't put it in a spreadsheet. You can't quantify a 9-year-old who spent 2 years afraid to trust anyone finally calling someone family because that person showed up every single day without fail and never once made her feel like an obligation. You can't put a number on a CEO who runs a company of 1,100 people and still finds 40 minutes to sit outside a locked bedroom door, talking my daughter through a panic attack because she understood what it felt like to be a kid getting rearranged by adults who said it was for her own good. His voice was shaking slightly now, and he let it, because the emotion was real, and he'd stopped trying to hide it. I'm not going to tell you this marriage started with the kind of love poets write about, because that would be a lie. And I don't lie to protect people's comfort anymore. I learned the hard way what that costs. But I'll tell you what's true right now, today, in this room. I trust this woman with my daughter's lives. I have watched her build something real out of something that started as obligation. And I have watched her do it with more integrity than most people manage when nothing is at stake at all. You want to know if what you're seeing is genuine. I can't make you believe it. But I can tell you that whatever fast and strange way this family started, it is not fake. And you do not get to dismantle a company over a feeling that a woman in a wheelchair, married or not, partner or not, isn't stable enough to lead it. That's not governance. That's prejudice wearing a suit. The room was silent in a way that felt, for the first time all morning, like silence with weight behind it rather than disapproval. Nathan sat back down, his hands shaking slightly under the table, and didn't dare look at Vivian, afraid of what he might see, afraid of what he might feel. Whitfield recovered, but it took him a visible second longer than before. Touching, he said, an edge of contempt creeping into his voice now that the polish had started to slip. But sentiment isn't governance, Mr. Cross. No, said a woman near the far end of the table, a board member named Patricia Reyes who had been silent through most of the meeting. But watching a man stand up unprompted and defend his wife's competence with that much conviction tells me something about her character that your binder full of vague concerns hasn't managed to tell me in a year of meetings, Carl. I'd like to call the question. A murmur went through the room, and Whitfield's face tightened, the careful neutrality cracking just slightly at the edges, enough for Nathan to see underneath it exactly how personal this had been to him all along. The vote, when it finally came, was close, closer than Nathan would have liked, 6-5, with one abstention, but it landed in Vivian's favor. She kept her seat, kept her company, kept the 1,100 jobs that had been hanging in the balance of a room that had nearly let bias dress itself up as prudence and win the day. Whitfield left the meeting without shaking anyone's hand, and Vivian didn't celebrate. She sat very still in her chair for a long moment after the room cleared, staring at the table, and when Nathan finally looked at her, her face was wet again, silent tears she wasn't bothering to wipe away. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, once they were alone. "After everything I did to you, you stood up and defended me in front of my entire board." "I didn't do it for you," Nathan said, and watched her flinch slightly at that, before he continued, softer. "I mean, not only for you. I did it because everything I said in there was true. You have built something real with my daughters. That doesn't erase what you hid from me. It doesn't fix it. But it's true, and I wasn't going to let Whitfield use a lie about our family to take down something true about the rest of your life." "Where does that leave us?" Vivian asked, her voice small in a way Nathan hadn't heard from her before, not even in the worst of the kitchen confession. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, the woman who had saved his family with one hand and hidden a truth that could have broken it with the other, and he didn't have an answer yet, not a clean one, not one that resolved the tangle of anger and grief and something that still, infuriatingly, looked a great deal like love. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I know I'm not ready to walk away. Not today. Maybe that's not the same as forgiveness. I think it's a start, though." Vivian nodded, wiping her face, and outside the boardroom windows, the gray Seattle sky had finally started to break apart. Thin shafts of late afternoon light cutting through clouds that had sat heavy over the city all day. And neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing left to say that the silence between them, fragile and unfinished, wasn't already saying on its own. The drive home from the boardroom was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the night before. Not the brittle silence of two people who couldn't look at each other, but something more exhausted, more honest, like both of them had used up whatever reserves they'd been running on, and had nothing left but the bare truth of where they stood. "I should tell you the rest of it," Vivian said, as they crossed the bridge, the water below catching the last of the breaking afternoon light. "You only know part of what I found in that review. I think you deserve all of it, not pieces." "Okay," Nathan said. "The collapse wasn't an accident in the way the official report claimed. There was an engineer, not you, someone above you in the chain, who altered the load documentation after you submitted your concerns, to make it look like the warnings had come in too late to act on. I found the original timestamps. Yours came in 14 weeks before the collapse. The version that ended up in the legal file, the one used to justify pushing you out, had it dated 9 days before. Someone moved the goalposts to protect the project's schedule, and when it went wrong anyway, you were the easiest person to blame because you'd been the one making noise." Nathan stared straight ahead at the road, his jaw tight. "Do you have proof? Actual proof? Not just an internal review?" "I have the original file metadata. I have email correspondence between two project managers discussing the documentation cleanup before the regulatory inquiry. It's not enough to undo 4 years on its own, legally. Statutes of limitations, the company's since been dissolved into 3 different entities, but it's enough to clear your name publicly, if that's something you want. I had my legal team prepare a memo. I was going to give it to you regardless of what happened today. Whitfield or no Whitfield, us or no us." Nathan felt something in his chest, tight and complicated, something between gratitude and a fresh wave of anger that she'd had this for 6 weeks and chosen the timing of every reveal around her own comfort rather than his right to know. "When were you going to tell me? If I hadn't found the folder?" Vivian didn't answer immediately, and the silence was its own kind of confession. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I told myself after the vote. I told myself when things felt stable. The truth is, I kept finding reasons to wait, because every day I waited, the house felt a little more like ours, and I was terrified that the moment I told you, it would stop being ours and go back to being yours and mine. A man and a woman with a grievance between them instead of a family. It already is a grievance between us, Nathan said quietly. Keeping it from me didn't make it not exist. It just meant I found out from a banker's box instead of from you. I know, Vivian said. I'm not defending the waiting. I'm telling you why I did it, because you asked, and you deserve the real answer even when it makes me look worse, not better. They didn't resolve anything else in the car. They didn't need to. Nathan understood, in the quiet that followed, that there wasn't a single conversation that was going to fix what had cracked between them. It was going to take longer than one drive home, longer than one apology, no matter how honest. The house, when they pulled in, was lit up warm against the early evening, and through the front window Nathan could see Sophie's silhouette jumping on the living room couch, while the babysitter, a college student named Priya, who'd become a fixture over the past month, tried half-heartedly to get her to stop. Lily was visible too, curled in the window seat with a book, and something in Nathan's chest loosened at the sight of them, safe, oblivious, unaware that the day had nearly rearranged their entire world a second time. They don't know how close it was, Vivian said, following his gaze. How close we both came to losing all of this today, in more ways than one. They don't need to, Nathan said. Whatever happens with us, that part stays separate. I meant that this morning. I mean it now. It became, over those following weeks, something both of them tried to live by, even as the rest of the household's emotional weather remained unsettled. Nathan didn't move out of the guest suite, but he also didn't sit up late with Vivian at the kitchen island the way he used to, and she didn't push him to. There was a careful distance now, polite and aching, the distance of two people who used to be easy with each other and had forgotten, temporarily, how to find their way back to that ease. The girls noticed, because of course they did. Sophie asked about it directly, the way Sophie asked about everything, blunt and unfiltered. Are you and Viv getting a divorce? She asked Nathan one evening while he was tucking her in, her stuffed rabbit pinned under one arm. Nathan sat on the edge of her bed, considering how to answer a question that even he didn't have a real answer to. We're working some things out, he said. Grown-up things. It's not about you or your sister. You're not going anywhere, and neither is she. Is it about the company stuff with the mean man? Sort of, Nathan said, surprised at how much Sophie had absorbed despite their efforts to shield her. It's complicated. Viv cries sometimes, Sophie said, matter of fact, the way kids reported things without understanding the weight of them. I heard her. In the kitchen. I went to get water, and she didn't see me. Nathan's chest tightened. Did she say anything? No, she just looked sad. I gave her my rabbit to hold for a minute, and she said thank you and gave it back. Sophie yawned, already half into sleep. I think she's lonely sometimes, even with us here. He sat with that for a long time after Sophie fell asleep, the simple, devastating clarity of a 6-year-old's observation. He found Vivian later that night exactly where Sophie had described, at the kitchen island, a laptop open in front of her that she wasn't really looking at, her shoulders carrying the particular slump of someone who'd stopped performing composure because she thought no one was watching. Sophie says you cry in here sometimes, Nathan said. Vivian startled, then composed herself, then seemed to decide composing herself wasn't worth the energy. She wasn't supposed to see that. She sees everything. She just doesn't always say it out loud. Nathan sat down across from her, the old habit returning despite the weeks of distance. Are you okay? I'm tired, Vivian said. Tired of being the person who has to be fine all the time. The board fight is over, I won, my company's secure, and I should feel like celebrating, and instead I feel like I broke the one good thing that came out of any of it. Her voice wavered. I keep waiting for you to tell me you've made a decision. To leave or to stay or anything, and the waiting is its own kind of punishment. And I think that's fair. I think I deserve to sit in this uncertainty for as long as I made you sit in not knowing the truth. I just didn't expect it to hurt this much. Nathan was quiet for a moment, turning over weeks of careful distance, weeks of watching his daughters thrive in a house built partly on a hidden wound, weeks of missing, he could admit it now, sitting across from her, missing the easy 2 a.m. conversations they used to have, missing her crooked, surprised-at-itself smile. I'm not waiting to punish you, he said finally. I genuinely didn't know what I felt. I still don't, completely. But I know I don't want to keep doing this careful distance, both of us tiptoeing around each other like strangers in a house we built together. Whatever this is, whatever we decide, I don't want to keep living like we're not speaking when we both clearly are aching to. What do you want then? Vivian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to understand something first, Nathan said. Not about the lie, about the why underneath it. You said it started as guilt. When did it stop being guilt? Vivian thought about this seriously, like the answer mattered too much to rush. The third night, she said finally. You'd gone up to check on Sophie because she had a nightmare, and I heard you through the monitor in the hallway. Not the words, just the tone, how patient you were, how you didn't rush her back to sleep. You just sat with her until she calmed down on her own time. I sat on the stairs and listened to that for 20 minutes, and I remember thinking, this is what safety sounds like, and I'd never actually heard it before, not in my own childhood, not anywhere. That's when it stopped being guilt. I just didn't have the courage to say it for weeks after that, because saying it meant admitting how much I needed you to feel the same way back. And needing things from people has never gone well for me. Nathan felt something in his chest crack open, not in pain this time, but in something closer to recognition. I think it stopped being a transaction for me around then, too, he admitted. Maybe a little after. I remember thinking I should be more careful, that getting attached to an arrangement with an expiration date was a bad idea, and then watching you with Lily outside her door that night and thinking, I don't actually care if it's a bad idea. So, where does that leave us? Vivian asked again, the same question from days ago. Except this time it didn't sound like she was asking for reassurance. It sounded like she was genuinely asking, prepared for either answer. I think it leaves us needing to actually talk, Nathan said. Not in fragments at midnight when we're both too tired to be careful. I think I need you to tell me everything. Every piece of what you knew and when, no holding back pieces because they're hard to say, and I need to actually sit with all of it before I decide anything, instead of deciding in pieces every time a new piece surfaces. Vivian nodded, and over the next hour, she told him everything. The exact night she'd connected the name, the exact conversation with her legal team, every internal debate she'd had with herself about whether and when to tell him, including the uglier admissions, the times she'd told herself a delay was strategic when it had really just been fear. She didn't soften any of it. She didn't perform contrition either, the practice kind that asked for forgiveness through tone alone. She just told him the truth, finally, completely, and let him sit with all of it. Thank you, Nathan said when she finished, for finally giving me the whole thing instead of pieces. Does it change anything? I don't know yet, he said honestly, but it's a better foundation to decide from than what I had before. It took another week before Nathan felt anything settle in him clearly enough to call it a decision. It wasn't a single moment, no proposal-style scene, no dramatic declaration. It built instead through small accumulations. Sophie's birthday, which Vivian spent an entire Saturday planning down to a unicorn cake that Sophie talked about for days afterward. A parent-teacher conference for Lily that Vivian cleared her calendar to attend, sitting beside Nathan in tiny plastic chairs while a teacher described Lily's writing as remarkably mature for her age, almost like she's processing something through it. A quiet Tuesday evening when Nathan came downstairs to find Vivian reading to Sophie on the couch, doing voices for each character with a commitment that suggested she'd practiced, that this mattered to her in a way that had nothing to do with optics or strategy or guilt. He found her on the back deck again one night, the same spot from weeks before, and this time he didn't hesitate before joining her at the railing. I've been thinking about something you said, he told her, about not having anything in your childhood that this house has now. Dinners, someone caring how your day went. I keep thinking that you built all of this, not just the contract, the actual feeling of it, out of something you'd never had yourself. That's not nothing, Vivian. That takes a kind of faith I don't think people who grew up the way I did always understand, building towards something you've only ever imagined. I was scared the whole time that I was doing it badly, Vivian admitted, that I'd get it wrong, that kids could tell when someone was performing family instead of actually building one. They can tell, Nathan said. Sophie and Lily both can. That's exactly why this worked, even with everything underneath it that shouldn't have. They never once felt like they were watching you perform anything. Neither did I. Not really. Not even after I found the folder. That's what made finding it hurt so much. Because everything else felt so real that the secret felt like a betrayal of something I'd actually started believing in. What are you saying? Vivian asked carefully. I'm saying I forgive you, Nathan said. Not because it's easy, and not because what you did wasn't serious. It was. You hid something that mattered for reasons that were more about your own fear than about protecting me. And I'm not going to pretend that doesn't still sting some days. But I've watched you choose honesty even when it cost you everything. in that boardroom and in this kitchen, and I've watched you build something real with my daughters that no amount of guilt could fake for this long. I don't want to spend whatever time we have left circling the same wound. I want to actually try. Not the contract, not the year. Actually try. Like two people who chose each other instead of two people honoring an agreement. Vivian's breath caught, and for a moment she didn't say anything at all, just looked at him with an expression Nathan hadn't seen on her before. Not the composed CEO mask, not the careful, guarded warmth of the early weeks, but something fully unguarded, almost disbelieving. "You mean that?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I mean it," Nathan said. "I've spent 4 years being angry at a company that took everything from me, and I just found out the company has a thread connecting it to you, and instead of that making me hate you, it's made me realize something. You didn't build that fire, Vivian. You inherited ashes from people who came before you, and you've spent your whole adult life trying to build something better out of them. The prosthetics, the mobility tech, the company itself. You're not Granger Holt. You're the person who, when she found out what happened to me, chose to fix it instead of bury it, even if she took too long to tell me about it." "I love you," Vivian said suddenly, like the words had been sitting behind her teeth for weeks and had finally broken free. "I should have said it before I said anything else, that first night in the kitchen. I love you, and I love your daughters in a way I didn't know I was capable of loving anyone. And I am so sorry it took me this long to say it without guilt or strategy attached to it, just the plain truth of it." "I love you too," Nathan said, and the words landed in him with the strange, settling rightness of something true finally spoken aloud. "I think I have for weeks. I just didn't trust it yet, with everything else sitting underneath it." They stood at the railing for a long time after that, not saying anything else, the lake dark and quiet below them, and when Vivian finally reached for his hand, Nathan let her take it and didn't let go. The weeks after that settled into something neither performance nor contract, but simply life. Messy, occasionally tense, full of small repairs that took ongoing effort rather than one grand gesture fixing everything at once. There were still hard conversations, Nathan asked, more than once, to see every document related to the Granger Holt review, and Vivian gave him everything without hesitation, no more careful omissions. She offered formally to fund a public clearing of his name, a press statement correcting the record on the collapse. And Nathan surprised himself by saying he needed to think about it, not because he didn't want vindication, but because he'd spent so many years defined by what had been done to him that he wanted to be sure he was choosing the next step for himself, not just reacting to an opportunity placed in front of him. "Take whatever time you need," Vivian told him. "It's not going anywhere. The truth doesn't have an expiration date." Lily, in her own quiet way, seemed to register the shift in the house before either adult said anything explicit. She started leaving her door open more, started sitting beside Vivian at dinner without it being a special occasion, started one evening asking Vivian to help with a school project on family trees that required, Lily explained with the careful precision of a kid working through something complicated. "People who count even if they're not blood, because that's allowed. My teacher said so." "Who would you put on yours?" Vivian asked carefully. Lily looked at her for a long moment, weighing something. "You," she said finally, "if that's okay." Vivian didn't trust her voice to answer right away. She just nodded and reached over, and Lily let her hold her hand across the table, which was, Nathan understood watching it happen, possibly the single largest act of trust his older daughter had extended to anyone outside himself in over 2 years. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, not yet, not even close. There were still mornings when Vivian's pain flared bad enough that she needed help getting from bed to chair, and she let Nathan help now instead of hiding it, which was its own kind of progress. There were still moments when old grief surfaced unexpectedly, Sophie asking out of nowhere why her first mom didn't want to live with them anymore. A question that had nothing to do with Vivian and everything to do with a wound that predated her, that Nathan had to sit with his daughter through, holding her while she cried for something that had nothing to do with the new family forming around her, and everything to do with the old one that hadn't survived. But there was also this, a Tuesday evening, ordinary in every way except for how unremarkable its happiness felt. The 5 of them. Because somewhere along the way it had become 5, not 4, plus an arrangement, gathered in the kitchen while Sophie insisted on helping make dinner, which mostly meant standing on a step stool getting flour on everything within a 3-foot radius, while Lily set the table with the specific, deliberate care she brought to tasks she'd decided mattered, and Vivian sat at the island directing traffic with the relaxed authority of someone who had, somewhere in the last 2 months, stopped being a guest in her own family's life and become simply fully a part of it. "This is good," Nathan said quietly, standing beside her, watching his daughters bicker amiably over whether the garlic bread needed more garlic. "It is," Vivian agreed, leaning into him slightly, an easy, unguarded gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. "I keep waiting for it to feel less surprising. It hasn't yet." "Maybe it's not supposed to," Nathan said. "Maybe you're just supposed to keep being grateful for it instead." There was still a contract somewhere in a drawer in Vivian's office. 41 pages of careful legal language that had started all of this. Terms about a year, about an amicable ending, about a settlement that would set Nathan and his daughters up for life regardless of how things concluded. Neither of them had mentioned it in weeks. It sat there, increasingly irrelevant, a document describing an arrangement that the people living inside it had long since outgrown, replaced by something neither lawyer nor binder had a clause for: two imperfect people, and two girls who'd learned the hard way not to trust easily, slowly, messily, building something that no longer needed permission from any board or contract to be considered real. The year mark arrived on a Thursday, which struck Nathan as faintly absurd. That the day meant to close out a contract designed to reshape his entire life would fall on something as unremarkable as a Thursday, sandwiched between a dentist appointment for Sophie and a school project deadline for Lily, as if the calendar itself had stopped treating the date as significant months ago. Vivian's lawyer called that morning anyway, dutiful, professional, asking whether they wanted to schedule the formal dissolution paperwork or the renewal documentation, because the contract, true to its 41 careful pages, required an explicit choice. Vivian took the call in her office with the door open, and Nathan heard her answer before she'd even glanced his way for confirmation. "There's nothing to dissolve," she told the lawyer. "Draft whatever makes it permanent. Skip the renewal language entirely. I don't want this family running on a one-year cycle anymore. I want the version with no expiration date." She hung up and found Nathan in the kitchen doorway, watching her with an expression that must have given away more than he intended, because she crossed the room and kissed him before either of them said anything, the kind of unhurried kiss that didn't need an audience or an occasion to justify itself. "That felt official," Nathan said. "It is official," Vivian said. "Has been for a while now, if we're being honest. The paperwork's just catching up." It had been, in truth, a long stretch of ordinary months since the board vote and the confession that came after it. The kind of stretch that didn't make for dramatic recounting because nothing in it had been a crisis, which was its own kind of miracle for a household that had spent its first year lurching from one upheaval to the next. Nathan had taken the public clearing of his name, eventually, on his own terms and in his own time, 6 months after Vivian first offered it. He'd sat for one interview, brief and unglamorous, with a local business journalist who covered the Granger Holt story with more interest in regulatory accountability than in Nathan's personal drama, and the piece ran with a headline that finally, after 4 years, used the word vindicated instead of terminated. He hadn't expected it to feel like much. It had felt instead like setting down something heavy he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it had a weight separate from himself. He hadn't gone back to structural engineering, not exactly. He'd started almost by accident consulting for Ashcroft Dynamics Facilities and Infrastructure Division. Nothing nepotistic. He'd been careful about that, interviewing formally with the department head and disclosing the relationship up front, taking the position only after it was clear his qualifications stood on their own. It turned out there was a particular kind of satisfaction in building things meant to support people who needed support, mobility centers and accessible facilities designed by people who actually understood, intimately, what accessibility needed to mean. He liked the work. He liked, even more, coming home most nights to find Vivian already there, the calendar boundaries she'd set for herself in those early weeks having calcified over the year into something she genuinely protected rather than merely intended. Lily, 11 months in, had stopped flinching at good things. It was the change Nathan noticed most, watching his older daughter at school events, at the dinner table, in the unguarded way she now talked about plans for next year, for the summer after that, for a future she'd finally allowed herself to believe might actually arrive intact. She'd started writing, really writing, stories she kept in a notebook she didn't always let Nathan read, though she let Vivian read some of them, an honor Vivian treated with the gravity of a state secret. One story, Vivian told Nathan privately one night, had been about a girl whose house kept disappearing until one day it stopped disappearing, and nobody in the story ever explained why. The girl just woke up one morning and the house was still there. And that was the whole point. "She's processing it through fiction," Vivian said. Her teacher was right that day at the conference. I think that's how she's always going to work through the hard years. I think we should just let her. Sophie, for her part, had no complicated processing to do. She'd simply absorbed Vivian into her understanding of family the way 7-year-olds absorbed most things, completely, without reservation, retroactively rewriting her sense of normal so thoroughly that she sometimes forgot Vivian hadn't always been there. She'd started recently asking when she'd get a baby brother or sister, a question that had sent Nathan and Vivian into a quiet, searching conversation of their own one night on the back deck. Neither of them quite ready to answer it yet, but neither of them dismissing the question outright either, which felt, to Nathan, like its own kind of answer. The board, in the years since the vote, had reorganized itself considerably. Carl Whitfield had resigned 8 months in, after 2 more quarters of strong performance made his concerns look increasingly threadbare. And after Patricia Reyes, the board member who'd called the question that day, had quietly built a coalition of her own pushing for governance reforms that made it considerably harder for any future faction to dress bias up as prudence. Vivian had thrown her support fully behind those reforms, had spoken, for the first time publicly, about her own experience navigating a board that had tried to use her disability against her, not as a grievance but as a case study, a way of making the company's culture something other leaders with disabilities might actually want to walk into. I spent 6 years hiding the hard parts of this, she told an industry conference that spring. Nathan watching from the audience with Lily and Sophie beside him, both girls dressed up for the occasion and visibly proud in a way that made Nathan's chest ache. I thought hiding them made me stronger. It didn't. It just made me lonelier. The actual strength, it turns out, was letting people see the parts of me I used to think disqualified me from being taken seriously, and discovering that the people worth keeping around respected me more for it, not less. She'd looked for just a moment toward the audience when she said it, and Nathan understood the sentence wasn't only about the boardroom. It hadn't all been smooth, even in that quieter year. There'd been a hard stretch in the spring when Vivian's pain had flared for nearly 3 straight weeks, bad enough that she'd had to cancel a major product launch event, bad enough that Nathan watched her cycle through frustration, grief, and something close to shame, old patterns surfacing even after a year of practicing honesty. He'd sat with her through the worst of those nights, not trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, just present, the way she'd once told him she needed someone to be. Not everyone, but someone. I hate that you have to see me like this, she admitted one of those nights, exhausted, frustrated tears slipping out despite her best efforts. I don't hate it, Nathan said. I hate that you're in pain. I don't hate getting to be the person you don't have to hide it from. There's a difference. There'd been a difficult visit from Nathan's ex-wife, too, in the fall. The first time she'd come to Seattle in over a year, her relationship with the girls still tentative, still finding its shape in twice-yearly visits and phone calls that sometimes went well and sometimes ended in Sophie crying afterward for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. Vivian had handled that visit with a careful grace Nathan hadn't expected, staying present but not inserting herself, making space for the girl's biological mother without competing with her, understanding instinctively that her own role in their lives didn't require anyone else's diminishment to be valid. She's their mom, Vivian told Nathan afterward. That doesn't go away because I'm here. I'm not trying to replace anything. I just want to be one more person in their corner, not the only one. It was, Nathan thought, watching her navigate something that could have easily curdled into jealousy or competition, maybe the clearest evidence yet of who she actually was underneath the year of complicated beginnings. A woman who'd learned, the hard way, that love wasn't a finite resource you protected by hoarding it, that there was room in a child's life for more than one person who showed up for them. The wedding, the real one, not the courthouse formality that had started all of this, happened on a Saturday in early June, exactly 13 months after that first contract signing, in the backyard of the lakeside house, small and unpolished in all the right ways. There was no elaborate production, no press, nothing that resembled the corporate optics that had once been the entire point of their union. Just family. Nathan's brother flew in from Sacramento, a handful of close friends Vivian had quietly rebuilt relationships with over the year, having spent so long isolated by the demands of running her company that reconnecting with people had been its own slow project. Sophie was the flower girl, taking the job with the seriousness of a military operation, scattering petals with such concentrated focus that she nearly walked face first into a folding chair. Lily stood up as something between a bridesmaid and a witness, a role she'd specifically requested, reading a short piece she'd written herself, not from the secret notebook, this one she'd shown both of them in advance, asking for their blessing before she stood up in front of everyone and read it. "A year ago, I didn't believe in houses that stay," Lily read, her voice steady despite the visible nerves. 11 years old and somehow already understanding something it had taken the adults around her considerably longer to learn. "I believed in houses you leave before they can leave you first. I'm glad I was wrong. I'm glad some people stay even when it would be easier not to, even when staying means telling the truth, even when the truth is hard, even when staying means fighting for people even when it costs you something. That's what family actually is, I think. Not the people who never make mistakes, the people who stay and fix it anyway." There wasn't a dry eye among the small gathering by the time she finished, least of all Vivian's, who reached for Lily's hand the moment she sat back down, the same gesture from the family tree project months earlier, except this time there was no hesitation in either direction. Nathan, standing across from Vivian under a simple arch strung with the kind of flowers that grew wild around the lake, rather than anything imported and arranged, found himself thinking, as he said his vows, about $14 in a wallet and an eviction notice folded into a square small enough to hide. He thought about how close he'd come, that night, to believing there was no version of his life that didn't end in his daughter sleeping in the back of a car indefinitely, in shame eating through whatever was left of him after 4 years of being told, in every way an industry could tell a man, that he didn't matter enough to be believed. He thought about how the same accident that had taken something irreplaceable from Vivian, her legs, her old life, years of grief he'd watched her carry quietly even after she'd let him in, had also, impossibly, eventually given both of them something neither had any right to expect, a second chance built out of wreckage, both literal and otherwise. "I'm not going to pretend this started the way most marriages do," he said, when it came time for his vows, looking at Vivian instead of the small audience behind her. "It started as a contract because I was desperate and you were scared, and neither of us had the luxury of waiting for something more conventional to come along. I used to think that made it less real. I don't think that anymore. I think the truest things in life rarely arrive on schedule, dressed the way you expected them to be. I think you taught me that love isn't about perfect timing or perfect honesty from the very first day. It's about what two people choose to build once the imperfect truth is finally out in the open, and what they're willing to keep choosing every single day after that, even when it would be easier to walk away. I choose you, not because of a contract, because every single day for the past year, you've given me a reason to choose you again, and I don't see that changing, not in a year, not in 50. Vivian's vows were shorter, and she stumbled over them slightly, which surprised everyone who knew her as a woman who never stumbled over anything in public. I spent most of my adult life believing that needing people was a weakness I couldn't afford, she said. I built an entire company, an entire identity, around being someone who didn't need anyone, because the one time in my life I'd been truly vulnerable, on a highway in the rain, the world had taken something from me I never got back. I thought strength meant never being in that position again. I was wrong. I think now that the bravest thing I ever did wasn't building a company or winning a boardroom fight. It was telling the truth to a man I was terrified of losing and trusting that he'd still be standing there after I did. He was. He still is. I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful for that, or for 2 daughters who taught me, faster than I taught myself, what it actually means to be somebody's family. Nathan, Lily, Sophie, you didn't just give me a home. You taught me I was allowed to want one. The reception that followed was small and loud in the way good ones are. Sophie falling asleep in a lawn chair before the cake was even cut. Lily dancing with her father in a moment Nathan would replay for years afterward. The two of them moving badly and laughing about it. None of the old wariness left in her at all. At some point in the evening, Nathan found himself standing at the edge of the yard with Vivian, watching the lake go dark. The same view from the same deck, where so much of their hardest and best conversations had happened over the past 13 months. "Do you ever think about how different this could have gone?" Vivian asked. "If you hadn't found that folder, if I'd kept waiting for the perfect moment that never came?" "I think about it sometimes," Nathan admitted. "I used to think the worst thing that happened to us was the lie. I don't think that anymore either. I think the worst thing would have been never finding out at all, going years, maybe a whole life, building something on a foundation neither of us ever fully trusted because we were both too scared to test it. Finding it the way I did, ugly and accidental, forced us to actually find out if what we had could survive the truth. It did. I think that matters more than if it had never been tested at all." "That's a generous way to look at one of the worst nights of my life," Vivian said. I've had practice finding the generous way to look at terrible nights, Nathan said. Most of the worst nights of my life turned out to be doors, not walls. I just couldn't always tell the difference while I was standing in them. They stood there a while longer, not saying much else, the party continuing softly behind them, two imperfect people who'd come together first through an act of rescue, and then through an act of necessity, and finally, slowly, through the much harder and much more ordinary work of choosing each other on the days it would have been easier not to. There was no contract anymore dictating any of it. There hadn't been, in any way that mattered, for a long time. What remained was simpler and harder than any 41 pages of legal language could have captured. Two people who had hurt each other and stayed anyway, who had built a family out of equal parts gratitude and grief and stubborn, ordinary love, the kind that didn't announce itself with fireworks, but showed up instead in dinner table conversations and math worksheets and someone holding your hand through a bad night without being asked. Later, much later, after most of the guests had gone and the girls had been carried up to bed, Nathan found Lily's notebook left open on the kitchen counter. A new entry started that night, unfinished, just a few lines scrawled in her careful, deliberate handwriting before exhaustion or sleep had pulled her away from it. People think families are something you're born into or you're not, she'd written. I used to think that too, but I think now that a family is actually something you build, slowly, out of whoever shows up and stays. Some people get the lucky version where it's easy from the start. We didn't get that version. We got the hard one, the one where everybody had to choose it over and over, even on the days it would have been simpler to walk away. I think I like our version better, actually, because everyone in this house chose to be here. Nobody's just stuck with us by accident. Nathan closed the notebook gently, careful not to disturb the page, and stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen that had once felt, to a man with $14 and an eviction notice in his pocket, like the nicest room he'd ever slept in and nothing more than that. A temporary kindness, a debt being repaid, a year he'd have to survive before real life resumed somewhere else, somewhere smaller, somewhere his. It hadn't turned out to be temporary. It had turned out to be the room where real life had actually started, the place where two broken people and two girls who'd learned not to trust good things had slowly, clumsily, honestly built something that no contract had ever been capable of guaranteeing, and no lie had ultimately been strong enough to destroy. Outside, the lake was dark and still, and somewhere upstairs his daughters were sleeping in rooms that were finally, truly theirs, in a house that had stopped being anyone's debt and become simply everyone's home.